Recently, a post by David Heermeyer Hansen has been making the rounds in open source circles. Open source is neither a community nor a democracy. So I thought, hey, why not give my take on it as well? For the most part, I agree with what is being said here. I just have some minor qualms with some of the details. But let's get right into it. Using open source software does not entitle you to a vote on the direction of the project. The gift you received is the software itself and the freedom of use granted by the license. That's it. And this ought to be straightforward, but I repeatedly see that it is not. And I think the problem stems from the word community, which implies a democratic decision-making process that never actually existed in the open source world. Now, I agree with the opening statement here. I don't agree with the premise that the reason why people have this stance is because the word community is used. The term community is also used in the gaming community, for example, and whilst people do expect improvements to be made to a game, granted in this case there is a direct monetary transaction in most cases, I don't think most people expect to be able to vote on what is happening in the project. They do expect to be able to give feedback, and you can absolutely give feedback, but even in that situation, your feedback doesn't have to be listened to, and in most cases, a lot of the people giving feedback are disagreeing with each other on the fundamental feedback they're giving. I think where the issue arises is when we're doing this open source development, all of the communication channels and development processes in most projects, there are exceptions, there are like private mailing lists in some cases, but in most other cases, all of this stuff is done in the public. It's done with anybody being able to get involved and anybody being able to see it. This allows anybody to really easily get involved, even if they don't have the experience and the knowledge to do so. First of all, community implies that we're all participating on some degree of equal footing in the work required to further the welfare of the group. Communities can have leadership, so I don't think that's necessarily true. But that's not how the majority of open source projects are run. They're usually run by a small group of core contributors who take on the responsibility to advance the project, review patches, and guard the integrity of the vision. The division of labor isn't even close to be egalitarian, it's almost always distinctly elitist. I don't know if elitist is the term I would use, because I feel like the healthiest projects out there are based on a meritocratic principle. If you provide the best patches, the most patches, and you are being the most useful member of this development environment, generally those are the people that move up in the project, and eventually if the current maintainer steps down, that person is who is going to take over the project. But it is certainly true that projects are usually run by a small group of core contributors. Even when we're talking about projects like Wayland, for example, which are basically by definition designed by committee, realistically, only a very small group of people in that committee are actually voting members and can decide if a protocol is going to be implemented. It's like 1 or 2 people per each of the desktop projects. Now, I can give my feedback, I can talk about problems, and I can talk to people involved in the project and sort of encourage them in one direction or another. But ultimately, my vote from outside of the project doesn't really matter that much. If you look at the way that most projects are structured, you will have a very small group of core contributors, and even if there are like 500 contributors on a project, if you look at the GitHub contributor graph, it goes down very quickly. It'll be like 4 or 5 people that give 99% of the commits, and then after that, everyone else is like 5 commits here, 3 commits here, 2 commits here, and it just keeps going down and down and down. That's good. Elitism is good. When it comes to open source, you absolutely want projects to be driven by the people who show up to do the work, demonstrate their superior dedication and competence, and are thus responsible for keeping the gift factory churning out new updates, features, and releases. Productive effort is the correct moral basis of power in these projects. In a sense, I do think this is correct. You want a project to be run by the people who are actually willing to step up and get the work done. Where I think elitism completely breaks down is when a project isn't willing to bring new people on, when they're not willing to open up the doors to new potential contributors. In these cases, project contributors, they age out of the project, they move on to other things, they get a job, they get a new job, and these projects tend to die out if they're not bringing new people in. If a project is popular enough and there are people who are willing to work on it, sometimes forks are going to arise, but there is a lot more software that has died out over the years than there is software that has a new successful fork. Even in those more welcoming projects, the most important people are ultimately those who are getting the work done, who are actually writing the code, actually doing the design documents, and bringing the project forward. But this elitism is also the root of entitlement tension. What makes you think you're better than me, us, the community, in setting the direction for this project? Wouldn't it be more fair if we ran this on democratic consensus? And it's hard to answer these questions in a polite way that doesn't aggravate the tension. So we usually skirt around the truth that not all participants in an open source project contribute equally in neither volume nor value. And this discrepancy is the basis of the hierarchical nature of most projects. It is not, and never will be, one user, one vote. That is, it will never be democratic, and this is good. I would love to see someone try this, and I might just do it myself. I would love to see what would happen if you did have a project where every single person had an equal voice in that project. If you wanted to commit code, you could commit code. If you wanted to block a merge request, you could block a merge request. If you wanted to make one, go ahead and do so. Every single person has equal ability to do whatever they want in the repo, obviously, except for deleting the entire thing. I want to know how long, probably a mere matter of minutes, this would take to completely implode. The democratic ideals are fulfilled by the fact that open source is free and full of alternatives. Don't like how they're running a given project? Use one of the usual countless alternatives. Or start your own. Here, you can even use the work of a million projects that came before you as a base for doing new work, as in making a fork. You will often hear things like, FOSS is about choice. How dare this project take away options? Usually that is directed at something like GNOME, for example, because there was a period where they were taking away a lot of things as they were building in new options, and a lot of those options just didn't come back because they didn't really fit with the direction of the project. And people see this as like a attack on FOSS, like how dare they not have these options available? But that's not what the choice is all about. And I disagree that FOSS is about choice in the first place. It's about freedom to, analyze the code and modify the code. But if we're going to talk about choice, the real choice is being able to select the software that you want to use. If you want to use a new desktop, you can do that. If you want to use a new distro, you can do that. If you want to go and start your own or fork an existing one, you can very easily do that. But at the end of the day, if you don't have the ability to make your own fork or develop your own software, you can discuss the issues with a developer. But really, if you don't provide a paycheck, you shouldn't be expecting anything out of them. Even the software just basically working. It's nice to have it working, but if it doesn't affect that developer, they don't have to go and fix it. But the reason this doesn't resolve the tension is that it still relies on showing up and doing the work, and there just so happens to be far fewer individuals willing and capable of doing that than there are individuals who wish they had a say on the direction of their favorite software. You can't solve that tension, only acknowledge it. I've dealt with it for literally 20 years with my own work on Rails and a million other open source projects. There's an ever-latent instinct in a substantial subset of open source users who continuously rear itself to question why it's the people who do the most work or deliver the most value or start the most projects that get to have the largest say. There are so many other things which we can talk about mattering, like being nice to everyone, and for other things outside of the code, that's great, and it makes it easier to, get along with people across different projects. But internal to a project, at the end of the day, the only thing that really matters is the results. The only thing that really matters is getting the code done, getting the designs done, and making the project better. And this is why so many forks live and die within such a short period of time. People realize very quickly that they are simply not suitable to take on that role. If you fork something like the Yuzu emulator, and let's just assume that Nintendo isn't trying to take down all of these repos, if you don't know how emulation works, you can't really make any substantial changes to that project, and you forking it just really hasn't done anything besides making a mirror. And when people talk about open source burnout, it's often related to this entitlement syndrome, although it's frequently misdiagnosed as a problem of compensation, as if begging for a few dollars would somehow make the entitlement problem bearable, and I don't think it would. Programmers frequently turn to the joy of open source exactly because it exists outside the normal employment dynamics of quid pro quo. That's the relief. Now, I don't think you can say this as a general statement. I think this is going to come down to the individual contributor. You might be someone who is making plenty of money outside of the project and really doesn't need to care about making money from open source. But there are some people out there who just don't like the model of working a programming job, going to a company, working a 9 to 5 or whatever hours they have you working, and actually getting paid to work on this open source project would make dealing with users considerably more bearable. And then others out there are paid by a company to work on a specific open source project, but not paid to work on others. So in the context of the project they're paid on, maybe they are more willing to deal with users, but on the other projects, you know, it's just not their problem. Now they're working on their free time. Again, this is very much an individual contributor thing, and this is probably the only part of the entire post that I completely disagree with. I frequently argue that open source is best seen as a gift exchange, since that puts the emphasis on how to react as a receiver of gifts. Most people, if they're getting a gift, are probably going to accept it with, you know, friendliness and not demand more from that gift. Now, if you're a child, maybe you will, but you know, the metaphor falls apart if we're talking about that. But if you're going to use another word as an alternative to community, I suggest you look at ecosystem. Ecosystems aren't egalitarian. There are big fish and little fish. Sometimes the relationships are symbiotic, but they're also potentially parasitic. Ecosystem is a weird word. I do like the term, but it kind of feels like it has a bit of additional baggage to it as well. If I say ecosystem, this sort of implies that there is some sort of, you know, management looking at everything going on and making sure it all fits together, and really that's not how it works. There are these individual silos all working on their own things, and sometimes they do come together to work on cross-desktop standards, but other times, not so much. But when it comes to community, I have a completely separate issue. I don't really like it being applied to these very wide groups, like the open source community, because you could be working on a text editor, a browser, an operating system, a missile. Like, these are entirely different systems. The only thing that you share is maybe you use a similar license. It's the same as the gaming community. You're a part of the gaming community if you play Bejeweled, but also if you play Baldur's Gate 3. Like, these are both games, and if you're dedicated to that game, you're part of the gaming community, but they're not at all related besides the fact that they are games, and maybe everything you like about the thing in this community, you completely disagree on. But whatever word you choose, you do well to remember that open source is first and foremost a method of collaboration between programmers who show up to do the work, not an entitlement program for petulant users to get free stuff or a seat at the table where decisions are made. Now, that is not to take away from the people out there who can't code or can't afford to pay, but outside of reporting bugs and giving feedback and asking if a change could possibly be made, you don't really have any power in the project. You can certainly encourage people in the project to do things, you can make videos on things, and get a lot of discussion happening around an issue, but at the end of the day, if you are not writing the code to get that fix done, that fix doesn't have to get done. That is, unless you bring out some money and someone is willing to work for a paycheck. But what do you think about the post? Let me know your thoughts in the comment section down below. If you liked the video, go like the video. And if you really like the video and you want to become one of these amazing people over here, check out the Patreon, subscribe, Pay, linked in the description down below. That's going to be it for me, and go and make some cool software. Something like this.